follow for the session. And what I hope that this will do is perhaps stimulate the people who are watching this recorded webcast to come up with their own ideas and their own questions, because there are some things that really require some thought. And so for those of you who are on this, I hope that we're going to have a conversation about some of the diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging topics that we're going to be talking about. So if it's okay, I'm going to just share in my screen, which has kind of the outline for the whole presentation. And then I'd like to encourage everybody who is on this video to please jump in whenever you wish, and please feel free to ask questions or to offer your own comments and your own thoughts. So, all right. So we're okay. We're okay on the share, right? Everybody can see this, correct?
Yep.
Okay, good. So, first of all, it's important that we have a definitional perspective on what we mean when we talk about DEIB or DEIJ, and I'll explain the meaning and the reason for the B as we go along. So I think you all know that diversity, when we talk about diversity, we're talking about representation. We're talking about we want representation in terms of race, gender identity, ability, ethnicity. We want people who are participating in speech and debate to have other people who look like them, feel like them, involved in the activity as well. Equity is access to opportunity. It does not mean equality. That's a common misconception. I think you all know that. So inclusion is celebration of identity. So people's identities are celebrated. They are not tolerated. They are not viewed as other, but individuals are truly celebrated for the aspects of their identity. A lot of DEI work includes a J here for justice. And the reason that I didn't include the justice here is that a lot of times when we think of justice, we think of something as a remedy or punishment. And we want to separate the DEI work that we're talking about, especially within our tournaments. We want to separate that from the competitive aspect, right? So we do not want to create the idea that the diversity, equity, inclusion work is tied to competition, and that we're only interested in equity in judging, for example. We're talking about equity and celebration of identity for everybody who's participating in the activity. So that's why much DEI work now includes the B for belonging, which is feeling welcome for being who we are. Okay. So the outline of the session is as follows. We're going to just cover some background and rationale for DEI work in speech and debate. We'll talk about DEIJ on our teams. We'll talk about DEIJ at our tournaments. Now you see that I've used the J instead of the B there. And then we're going to just have some conversation and some discussion on that afterward. So let's talk about Ohio. I think you will mostly agree that Ohio speech and debate is largely white. We do have some significant East Asian and South Asian participation in some areas and events. There are some school districts that have significant Asian populations that participate. There are some particular events which have some history of being more welcoming of some ethnic groups than other activity or other events are. Speech and debate is largely cis-normative and heteronormative in Ohio. We're also lacking participation in urban and rural areas. We have very, very few schools that are city schools. In the entire Cleveland Metropolitan School District, there is only one school that has ever really participated since Shaw High School back in the 1980s. Vicky, is that about right? When Shaw was a big powerhouse in speech and
Yeah,
debate?
they may have participated into the 90s, but as soon as Bonnie left,
Right.
it died.
Yeah. So really, urban participation is very, very small. That's true of the other major urban areas as well. And also, if you draw a line from just south of Cincinnati to just south of Columbus to just south of Youngstown, and you draw that line across the state, there are 0 participating schools in that entire southeastern quadrant of Ohio. So that's about a third of the state that has no speech and debate. That's mostly rural Appalachia, and we have no access to speech and debate there. So a little bit of history on the DEI work that has been done in speech and debate. So nearly all equity work is focused on tournament outcomes, right? So it's all been about judging, and we've done a lot of training, and a lot of work has been done around especially the impact of gender identity and presentation. There has been a lot of training on implicit bias that has mostly focused on judges. The idea is to get judges to recognize the biases that they might hold as they approach judging in the activity. There may have been some impact over the last couple years. People in debate will tell you that there seems to have been an increase in the success for female identified and presenting debaters. That's a little bit muddied because the last 2 years, major tournaments have all been online as well. So there may be a contributing factor as well there. When we talk about outreach into underserved communities and areas, it's been really mostly sporadic and hasn't really had a lot of success. No one has really figured out how to really increase outreach into the underserved areas that we talked about earlier. There was some momentum around that in the Columbus district and the GMV districts before the COVID pandemic. And of course, the COVID pandemic slowed just about everything down, including the DEI work that was being done down there. And really, and this is a fact that we often don't think about, but with the exception of developments in technology with SpeechWire and Tabroom and tabbing software and stuff like that, the tournament experience has really remained pretty static for the last 20 years, at least the last 20 years. Now, online tournaments in the last year have certainly been different, but when we as a state are back to largely in-person tournaments, they're going to look a lot like they did 20 years ago. The same gatherings of students. It will be the same, the same food, the same award ceremony. Everything's going to look pretty much the same as it has for 20 years. That's not good or bad. It's just an observation that our tournament experiences really haven't changed much. Y'all feel free to jump in here at any point in time if you want to contribute something.
So on that point, Rich, do you feel like our teams have changed in the last 20 years? Are our teams different than they were 20 years ago?
Well, so Peter, I mean, that's a really great question. Okay. I think that our teams are not as different as perhaps we would like them to be. So, for example, when you look around a speech and debate tournament, with the exception of a few types of events, you won't see many Black students participating in the activity. And it's only fair to ask, why is that? Why is it that speech and debate is not attractive to Black students, right? And why, is there possibly a component in what the speech and debate tournament experience feels like for Black students to where it is something that where perhaps they don't feel as welcome as we would want, right? And again, this is just all supposition, right? I don't pretend to have any, any evidence for why participation is as it is. What I can tell you is I would like to see more diversity on our teams in
I
general.
totally agree with that, of course. I guess in response to that last item on the last slide, I was just thinking out loud.
Sure.
That is also true, not just of what we see at tournaments, but also what we see on our teams at our schools.
You're absolutely right. I absolutely agree with you. If we look at, schools that have had memberships for the last 20 or 25 or 30 years, yes, you're right. The type of students that they are bringing to tournaments on a weekly basis look pretty much the same as they did 20 or 30 years ago. I agree with you completely.
I was just thinking, like, I know our team has a lot more female like participation than maybe we did a few years ago. Peter, you're still very few females on your team. Really thrown off the point there. But I've not thought about it in this sort of way where it has been really judging focused and really competitively focused. And in some ways, I think that coming back from COVID is this really golden moment to jump on this work, because there's this built-in empathy of like everyone's been so isolated and felt just like maybe unwelcome isn't the right word, but like it's not comfortable when you're sitting alone in your basement doing 15 acceptance speeches in a row. But in other ways, like there's not, it's difficult to have anything social. Like, my students who are older have a lot of friends from other schools. It's harder for my little ones to do that right now. So in some ways, for the last year and a half, and hopefully not much of this year, it's just been competitive. Like,
Yeah.
you come together for the tournament results. And so I think we have in some ways more of an uphill battle coming out of COVID, and in other ways, like maybe this really prime moment where everyone can hopefully relate to what it feels like to not feel comfortable.
Yeah, I know even at my previous school, and let's face it, the majority of that school district was 98% white. It was literally the entire 20 years I was there, or wait, no, it was 16 years there, 15 years there. It was telling the kids when we were doing our recruitment at the 8th grade is, I want diversity on our team. So we're specifically making sure that we talk to every kid that is different than us. And part of the recruitment was we did not focus on the competitive aspect of speech and debate. We talked about when you're joining speech and debate, you're joining a family. You have like a big brother that's a senior that's watching out for you as a freshman, and that you have people you can go to ask for help with your classes. If you're struggling in math, we'll help you. If you're having a hard time writing a paper, there's plenty of people to help you write a paper and to work through that process. We really worked on not trying to build a competitive team, but trying to build a team that was a family that supported each other.
Well, one of the things that I can, I'll react to two things. I did the program in Cleveland for essentially urban debate for 2 years and was a mentor to St. Martin de Porres. And the coach of that team, the monitor of that team, had been a competitor at Howland. So she knew what the speech and debate world was all about, and she had been successful in it. And when I suggested to her kids that they might want to come to a tournament that was closed, and it was hard for them because they came from all over the city to go to St. Martin de Porres, and to come to St. Martin de Porres on a Saturday morning, then to go somewhere else was asking a lot for kids who didn't always have transportation. Almost universally, the kids said, we wouldn't feel comfortable being with all those rich suburban kids. I mean, it was a clear thing. They were bright kids. They could argue well. They had great ideas. And they just said, I wouldn't be comfortable. And I wonder, when you ask about things that have changed in the last 20 years, certainly there are more girls competing in the debates. There's no doubt about that. And I don't know what the numbers are in the speech events. I would imagine they're more diverse in terms of gender. But there are still things that are perceived to be a certain group's event. I mean, and I'm not the first person to make the comment that once upon a time, since I'm the elder statesman of this group, I said, remember when there were those good Anglo-Saxon names like Tom Smith? And I could remember the first time I had to pronounce Anurag Chigarapati and go through the list and extent. So there's clearly been the change you indicated with Southeast Asia, but we still have a perception that it's an elitist activity, that you have to be incredibly smart. And I was never successful at Magnificat in recruiting any Black students at all. You know, they just said, oh no, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough. And I hadn't even said anything about being smart, but there's a perception of that.
Yeah, if I have a disappointment as we come out of COVID, it is that I had this sort of naive hope that the necessity of being online and remote might enable us somehow to branch out into some schools and some communities that were really hindered by the idea of having to get on a bus on Saturday and travel to a tournament, right? Because when you're online, theoretically, that should make access easier, except for the fact that if you look at socioeconomic opportunity, being online makes access more difficult. So it's really, really a double-edged sword there. But when you go online, there are opportunities that arise that you don't have otherwise. So, for example, we would have the opportunity to have weeknight competition that would allow schools that cannot participate on Saturday for religious reasons to participate in speech and debate. But it requires an awful lot of courage to make some of those changes to make that happen, and that's a really hard thing to do. So I would like us to move into, so the next thing is, I've got 4 slides coming up, and all I want everybody to do, and those of you who are watching this on recording, you can play at home too. You're going excuse me, there's going to be 4 slides that pop up, and each one is going to have a question. And all you have to do is answer the question in your own mind. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to write anything down. So just answer the question in your own mind. Here they go. Here's number 1. Here's number 2. Here's the next one. And here's the next one. Okay. From those of you who are online, any thoughts? So
well, they certainly are stereotyped.
Let's take a look at the first one. Anybody want to volunteer which of these is a public forum debater?
I will. I said that it was the girl.
You said it was the girl.
And I said it because she has the look in her eye of, I can beat any argument you offer.
All right.
My gut assumes the boy. Like, if I'm looking at it and I'm living in the immediate path of least resistance in my brain, my brain is going to assume the boy.
Okay. They are both public forum debaters. Okay. How about this one? International extemp. So of course the natural assumption, right, is that the South Asian boy is definitely an extemper, right? Mm-hmm. These are both international extempers who competed at the national tournament this year. So by now you have the hang of it, right? These are both original orators. And these are both Division I recruited athletes. The girl on the right is a coxswain on a crew team at the University of Washington. So the idea here is, we coaches, we have biases, right? And I remember that John Mercer told the most wonderful story about his high school coach, who was the legendary Bob Santo, who came up to him one day when John was a freshman and said, "I heard you're smart. You should do extemp." And that was the extent of the conversation. And he put John in extemp, and John was terrible at extemp, but he turned out to be pretty good at humor. So, we make those assumptions, right? Put the smart kid in extemp, put the South Asian kid in extemp or in Lincoln Douglas, right? And, not all coaches do that, but many coaches do. We make assumptions about kids. There is a hesitation in many co-ed schools to have public forum teams of 2 girls, because there's a lot of evidence that girl teams are not as competitively successful as boy teams or boy-girl teams. So those are the sorts. Those are the sorts of assumptions that we make as coaches. We funnel certain types of students into specific events. And then, our teams can also exacerbate the stereotypes, right? They recruit their friends who look like them and who they hang out with. And sometimes they're even resistant of new team members who don't fit the mold, right? It's like, oh, we're gonna ask this athlete to be on our team, and the speech and debate kids may say, wait a minute, that's not comfortable for us. The athletes get to do everything. So there's a little bit of that, but the whole idea is that I think anyone, and I'm going to count the 4 of you who are on this video with me. Anyone who has ever gone out of their way to recruit someone who doesn't fit the mold and to work with that kid and to help them, have a positive experience in speech and debate will find that was a very rewarding experience, both for the student and for the coach. It's absolutely worth making that investment. So let's talk about our tournaments a little bit. Someone is typing and it's really loud. Thanks. So OSDA is recommending that tournaments have an equity office. And for many of us, we may not really know or understand what the job of an equity office is, how it gets implemented. Why do we even need this equity office? So the first question to ask is, well, what does it mean to be a good host? And here's my example that I like to use. I love to cook. I love to have people come over to my house for dinner, and often we'll have somebody to come for dinner who we've never had for dinner before. And so when they're coming for dinner, what I do is I reach out to them and say, hey, what kind of foods do you like? Do you have any allergies, right? We clean the house. We make sure the bathrooms are in good order. When people come to our house, we want them to feel welcome. We want them to feel comfortable, like they're one of the family. The same should really be true of our tournaments. We want every single person who comes to the tournament, no matter what their background is, no matter what school they're coming from, if it's their first tournament or if they've been a 45-year coach, we want them to feel like they really belong and that they really are going to have a positive experience there. That's part of the role of the equity office, to make sure that that experience is positive for every person who comes to the tournament. We have to ask ourselves if everybody who comes to our tournament feels welcome and feels safe. So the example that Vicki gave a little bit ago about the kids from the Urban Debate League, right, saying, no, we wouldn't want to come to a tournament with all those suburban kids. We would feel very much out of place. Okay, that is definitely not what we want at our tournaments. Recognize also that the tab room can be a really scary place. And I will tell you very honestly, when I first started coaching about 20 years ago, I was scared to go into the tab room, because every time I would go near the tab room, I would get yelled at for something or other, right? So imagine a kid who has just had an experience that was really difficult for that kid. And the only place that they can go to unpack this is the tab room. And, in the tab room, there are all these very seasoned white adults, okay, who are very opinionated and like to have things run their same way. And, you know, we're going to ask this 9th grade kid who has just had a problematic experience to go into the tab room and unpack that. That's a really hard thing to do. And things do happen at tournaments. I mean, this is unfortunate, but it's true. There have been, you know, just the verbal things, belittling and insulting of people, and that's the minor stuff. Kids are misgendered. Students have been groped, they've been bullied, they've been assaulted at our tournaments over time. And that is something that we cannot have. Unfortunately, the tournament experience might not be good for everybody who attends. I talked with another coach a while ago who didn't, who was questioning the need to do DEI work, right? And the rationale was, well, look, you know, we have Black kids who win state tournaments, right? So win the state tournament. We have transgender kids who are very successful debaters. So like, why do we have to do this work? Because these kids are being competitively successful. And, you know, my response to that is manyfold, but I'll give you a couple of them. First of all, in terms of representation, the number of Black students who we have is still very, very small. And just because one Black student wins a state tournament or has competitive success does not mean that we are a welcoming environment for Black students. For a transgender student, they may have won some debate rounds, but I also wonder how many times that transgender student was misgendered, and what have we done to support that student in the experience. It's entirely possible that someone can come home with a trophy and have had a horrible experience at the tournament. The competitive success and the experience that the tournament attendees have may not line up with one another. So we have to keep that in mind. So it's important to understand what an equity office is and what an equity office is not. So an equity office is not focused on the competition. The equity office is not there to decide who wins a round or who gets the one and who does not. The equity office is focused on the experience, to make sure that the experience of the tournament is positive for all attendees, irrespective of their competitive success or standing. Equity offices are not punitive. The idea is not to call out somebody for problematic behavior or actions and then punish them. The idea is to be restorative. And here is an example. One of my very good friends has been an equity officer at the NSDA national tournament for some time. And she has told me that whenever someone comes to the equity office, the equity officers ask, you know, irrespective of what the incident has been, they ask the person, what is it that you would like to have happen after all this is said and done? And 99 times out of 100, what the kid or the coach or the judge says is, I want someone to talk to them. I want them to learn. I want them to learn how this feels, what they did, so that it doesn't happen to anybody else. There's no intention to punish there. Nobody wants anybody to be disqualified from the tournament. What they want is education. They want learning. That said, the equity office is not confrontational. It's not accusatory. It is not set out as a trial. There is not a judge there who is going to pronounce a sentence on someone who might have exhibited some behavior that is problematic. It's meant to be collaborative. It's meant to be educational. So for those of us who have the long held mindset of what tournament officials do, right? And tournament officials enforce the rules, and tournament officials figure out who wins the round and who loses the round. And tournament officials scold judges who take too long on ballots, right? This is not what an equity officer does. The equity officer is there to make sure that people who attend the tournament feel safe, feel welcome, feel celebrated. And when something goes wrong, the equity officer is there to help to set it right, not to punish anybody, not to disqualify anybody from a tournament, but to help restore the feeling of the person who has had the issue that they can have a positive experience at the tournament. Becca, you've worked as an equity officer at tournaments before, right?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
I've
Has
done
that
it
been
for,
pretty much your experience, that that's the purpose of an equity office?
absolutely. Definitely for, I'd say when students come in and have an experience that was negative with a judge, sometimes the request is more along the lines of like, this round maybe wasn't, fairly adjudicated, but even still, it still tends to come from that place of like, I don't want this person to just go back into the pool. Like, it is often a need to just be heard. I've only done them online, which, I don't think I have the comparison yet to know whether that's better or worse. As I mentioned in a couple of the task force meetings, it does worry me a little if we were to make it a long-term plan that there's just a single Zoom every weekend. Like, it's one thing right now, we probably shouldn't all be in a room together. But when the world hopefully at some point goes back to normal, that's one thing where I'm really hopeful that there is a shift to in-person. And I know that for some districts that's not always possible, and there's, you need the humans for it, but it often strikes me that I wish those conversations were in person. But it is really like 9 times out of 10, the student is coming from a place of like, I don't want this to happen to someone else.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
sometimes even like, I know, there are certainly also students who come and realize that whatever the issue was didn't come from a place of malice. And it truly is a moment of just like, I think my competitor would want to have this education moment. Like, I don't think they would want to know how this affected me.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you bring up, you correctly bring up the point that we need to have, like in person, we want those conversations to happen. And I think one thing that being forced online has taught us is that we can be really efficient in using technology, and we might not need as many tab room people as we have had in the past. And so that might actually make it possible to designate, people who are very experienced and who would be good candidates for being an equity officer. Instead of putting them in the tab room, have them be the equity officer for a tournament. So that might be a silver lining there.
And you would definitely want a person that's empathetic
Oh, absolutely.
to be there. You don't want a person that has no tact, that is kind of like a curmudgeon that's only filling the role because you need someone. You need someone that's going to have empathy for what the kids are going through, what a judge might be going through, what a coach might be going through, or else it's not going to be successful.
You just disqualified about 3/4 of.
And I'm pretty sure a lot of people could say I disqualified myself at times.
Yeah, and we all have those moments, right, when we lose our patience just a little bit. But Jody, your point is really well taken. You do need someone who, who the attendees are just going to feel comfortable with, feel that they're going to be heard, and feel that they're going to be listened to. So,
I'm thinking of Dan Cece in particular, but I don't think he's alone. Like,
yeah,
people who do more like counseling, or they do like, Jody, I guess you already said you disqualified yourself, or like the intervention specialist. Like, I think that it would be helpful to have that sort of like roll call, because there are people in our community who, or we also have like lawyers, and I bet we have some therapists among us.
Oh, we absolutely do.
So, we have people who do it for a living and are better suited in some cases if they're willing to do it for one more Saturday.
Sure, absolutely.
In fact, the Columbus area, the session on student mental health, I think she's the Olentangy head coach, Natalie Chubb. She's a clinical therapist.
Hey, that's awesome. Let's get Natalie to be, to be an equity officer for, state tournament, right? So, all right. So here's some situations. So we're going to play, does this situation go to the equity office or the tab room or some combination thereof? So anyone feel free to jump in. A dramatic interpreter tells you that a judge fell asleep during their round. Equity office or tab room?
Tab room first.
Y'all agree with that?
Tab room first, then they can go to equity.
Yeah, I also agree with you. I think that is definitely a tab room issue, right?
That does make me think though of a conversation we had in a recent task force meeting, and Peter, you can fill in any dots that I'm leaving disparate, but people were talking about a moment at the state tournament where a student like got really angry and was like screaming, I think, in like some sort of Zoom room. And that was we were thinking of that. We were having that similar question, like, is this our work? Is this the work of just the tab room? And they were categorizing it under like the inclusion piece, that theoretically like a judge falling asleep makes you feel like not included. I'm not sure if I agree, if I disagree, but I think, I think that umbrella term can feel really wide.
Yeah, I think that in the case of a judge falling asleep or the allegation that a judge fell asleep during a round, I think that the tab room does have a responsibility there to make sure that the round was adjudicated fairly. So because it has that competitive, that competition aspect to it, I think that's where the tab room comes in. So next one, a female LD debater tells you that her male opponent put his arm around her as they left the room.
Equity.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's put y'all on the spot. So as the equity officer here, what do you do?
Well, one, you hear her out. Like, is it a feeling of sexual harassment or is it just a feeling of discomfort? And then it's a conversation with the competitor about consent, which has been a huge issue with the pandemic and social regression of behaviors.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, Jody, because that is something I think we all have to be aware of. As we get back into in-person competition, that we've had a year and a half of not being able to practice in interpersonal interactions and what is appropriate behavior.
The harassment aspect of that one also reminds me that one of my first questions might be, what do you want the outcome to be? But that's sometimes difficult, although essential, to balance with students understanding our role as a mandated reporter, that I never want a student to come in and just assume that they're telling us something in confidence, only to be like horrified and traumatized even more if what they share falls under that mandated reporting category. And that's where I find it helpful. And we had this on the NCFL issue reporting form, which I have access to. Like, who do you want to be contacted? For some student, it might be a coach and not a parent. For other students, it might be the inverse. Like, but
sure,
making sure they know what can't be a secret.
Yeah. So, all these scenarios, we're assuming that you're the coach and the kid has come to you. This one actually happened to me. This was one of my students, right? And when I heard out the student, what she said to me is, this guy thinks we're such good friends, but we're really not friends. And I just, I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it, but we are not the kind of friends where he can put his arm around me. And so we talked, at this point, there's no equity office here, right? So she and I talked through, well, what might be some ways that we could approach the situation, right? And she ultimately decided that she wanted one of her older friends to talk to the guy and say, hey, you made her feel uncomfortable. You're not that kind of friend with her. Please don't put your arm around her. And that worked out fine. And it was great, and he was very apologetic and he was, an absolute adult about it. So, all right. So misgendering, a debater tells you that their opponent repeatedly referred to them as she, even after repeatedly being asked to use the pronoun they. I don't think there's much question about this one, right?
No, but there is an issue that you need to talk with the kids about. And I'll give my own personal experience. I had when I was tutoring, I had two kids who I had had the year before, and they came in and said, I'm not Susie Q anymore, I'm Joe. And I went, okay. But periodically, I never made a mistake in talking with the individual student. But when they were together or when they were in another group, I would slip and I would say she instead of he to Joe. And I think that as an equity officer and even as coaches, we need to tell people that, yeah, there are microaggressions, but they're not all intended. And that it's something, especially if it's a person who is going through a transitional phase and kids know them from another place. Again, it's Becca's point, what do you want us to do about this situation?
Exactly.
Because just saying, we'll talk to them, that might be all it needs. Would you please talk to them as the equity officer?
No, that's very well stated. It can be, especially in gendering students, right? It can be challenging. The other thing is that many students who are in the questioning phase, right, or who are in a transitional phase on gender, they are not even comfortable sharing pronouns, right? So they, because they don't want to be outed yet. And so that is also a challenge, right? So, you know, especially while we're online, we can certainly encourage people to use their pronouns on their screen if they wish and if they're comfortable, but recognizing that there are some people who will not feel comfortable sharing their pronouns.
Yeah, and that ended up being an issue at my son's residential summer camp. About halfway through the month, one of his cabin mates came out as trans, said the name they wished to be called. And kids were very accepting. Well, the last day of camp, everyone's leaving. They say goodbye to her and reference her name, but she never told them that she wasn't out with her parents. And that created an issue. And that's why I'm kind of against the whole like forced entering it into SpeechWire, because kids might be open and out with some of their competitors, maybe even a coach, but they might not be out with their families or other members in their community. And a lot of this information, like our results packets and all that, are published publicly, and that would be open for public consumption.
That's a really good point, Jody.
I agree that that's never obviously what we want. I do think there's a lot of great resources and options out there that can help us like skirt the issue entirely. So, well, not skirt the issue, but like, for example, if I'm filling out a ballot, if I use enough passive voice, I never need a pronoun. Or, you know, if I just say like the pro team, like the argument, like I think if we get in the habit, and it's just habit, like, or if you just use they, period, like especially in PF if you're describing two children, like
just completely gender neutral terms.
Exactly. Like I think there are places there where we don't have to draw that attention to it, where it's not that someone is making a specific choice. But I think you're right that it's difficult in that way. And to Vicky's point, I do think that that's emphasizing that there's not always a lack of malice. Like for me, and I know Susan has said she feels the same way, like they is difficult only because I'm like, my English teacher is like, that's not singular. And I'm of course fine with using it as a singular pronoun, but I'm having to rewire a pretty well-trod pattern in my brain, which is the same reason that when I see those two pictures, I say, oh, the boy's the PF debater. So, you know, there's also just lots of great resources out there about like, what do you do when you mess up? And like, what is a really simple way to just correct yourself and keep moving?
And the other side of that is, from the equity office perspective, is to ascertain, you know, was it a mistake, or is this something deeper, right? And the reason I included this one is because there was actually, year before last, there was actually a public forum team at the national tournament that was actually removed from the tournament for what was determined to be intentionally misgendering a competitor. And there was a lot of conversation around that. The competitor who was being misgendered did not want any sort of punitive action. That person wanted it to be educative, but apparently what happened is the tournament office got involved and talked to the judge and interviewed people in the room and concluded that this was egregious and intentional misgendering and was a violation of the NSDA honor code. And that's why the team was removed from the competition. So, all right. So how about your PF team says their opponents accused them of abuse because they hadn't shared their case and evidence before the round?
I'd say tab, because that's dealing with competitive rules that don't exist.
Absolutely.
Great question. No theory in public forum. It's a multiple right answers moment.
Yeah, absolutely. The use of a racial slur by a white speaker.
Equity.
Absolutely.
Okay, and also, and it's definitely an equity issue, but in asking a student competitor what he, she, or they might want done, and they say, I just wanted you to be aware of it, or I'd like you to talk to the student. I think as an equity officer, I would want to say, I will honor your wishes, but I would also immediately go to the tab room and see, did the judge comment on the ballot and indicate anything? And I might also want to go to the coach immediately and say, did you okay this script? Okay, because those two things go beyond the round that the one student was in. A coach who would allow that kind of language needs to be also dealt with by an equity officer.
I agree, Vicki. I also think that one, especially if it's, if it's original oratory, that speech is going to happen 4 or 5 more times that day.
Right.
Certainly you want to honor the wishes and the request of the student who comes forward, but that is one where the safety then of everyone else who will be in every subsequent round also has to be considered. But that bullet point is a tough one for me. I remember a DI several years ago that had the N-word a couple of times.
Yeah, because sometimes it'll just give you a visceral reaction. And if you're one of those competitors that are performing next, like
Right.
It can have an effect on your performance.
Well, and it fit the plot, but made me super uncomfortable. And, that I think particularly in interp, like, I would probably argue like, let's get rid of it. But the use of slurs in interp is one that strikes me as an issue that I don't really know what to do with.
Right.
Yeah. So I can tell you that like these last two, these are things that I really have strong opinions of as a coach. And I would never under any circumstances let a white speaker or performance use a racial slur directed at a black person, even in an interp. And I would never let a white competitor perform a caricature of an Asian person as a villain, right? I actually think it's problematic for our activity. I think that it is something that we should work to eliminate. I know it's in the script, okay, but when you think about the impact on the other people in that room, I really have problems with that.
I agree with you. I mean, I definitely agree. And when I don't remember who I was talking to, but I was sort of kicking around submitting an action proposal that like, I never want to hear the N-word at a tournament. And, I think most of the counter arguments aren't as applicable to speech and debate. So for example, like there are plenty of white actors and actresses who have had to use the N-word in a role, in a movie where the role calls for it, but that's not timed. You're not in a place where you're having to say, okay, my intro where I can contextualize why I'm using this horrible word can't really be more than 30 seconds. And, I've got to keep it at 2 minutes and the shock needs to be here. Like, I think it just doesn't.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of against using racial slurs in any context, regardless of what race you are performing. And I've actually had discussions with my 8th graders last year when they were in 7th grade, because we had our unit on facing adversity, and we talked about racism, and we read Ghost Boys. And they asked me if I ever felt there was an appropriate time to say like the N-word, and I said no. They're like, even if it's a Black person? I'm like, no, because the word is such a derogatory word that regardless of who says it, it's still wrong.
Well, I think you need to examine that, because it's a lot different for a white person to use that word in any context than it may be for a group of Black friends to use it in their own
Vernacular.
personal interactions.
Sure. I
But,
agree with you,
there's
Vicky.
so much literature out there that someone who would choose to allow a kid to perform something with racial stereotypes or epithets probably is going for a shock value that we don't want to encourage.
Yeah, I agree with you, Vicky. So, all right. So moving toward the end here, just a couple of caveats about the equity office. First of all, I think it's clear, and in fact, this was mentioned earlier, right? Equity officers should be experienced teachers, coaches, or professionals who have been trained in DEIB best practices. We need to remember as we move back into in-person competition that a student should never, ever have to be alone in a closed room with an adult they do not know.
How are you going to do extemp?
Leave the door open. You know, I mean, that's about the best we can do, is leave the door open. Especially for a young female, you know, speaker and an adult male judge, right?
Or a young male speaker.
Yeah.
Just in general, with all the grooming issues
Yeah.
that have been going on, it makes me super uncomfortable
Yeah.
in any instance, even with extemp.
Yeah, we need to think about how we do extemp.
Sometimes calls for like a lower entry limit. Like I can think of places where I've been in a literal closet.
Sure.
And I left the door open. I would not have heard a word that this student said. And so that might mean that like we need to bring one fewer extemper per team for that tournament. Like being more realistic about our available rooms is also important.
In high school, I competed in extemp one year, and I had to give a speech in the boys' locker room shower.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are all kinds of horror stories about that.
And it was in the basement of a building. I could have screamed and no one would have heard me.
Yeah. No, I think you're all right. We really have to think about that. You know, we really need to think about how we utilize rooms in our tournaments. If a student is coming to the equity office, they should be allowed to bring a coach or a teammate with them. The student should never feel like they are being put under a spotlight. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, and we already got to this, right? Even though the equity office isn't about competition, there's going to be significant events that need to be reported to the tournament director, or to the district chair, or to the OSDA office, you know, depending on what the event is. So that connection still has to happen.
Logistically, the other place where that connect, where I've experienced, like when I've been in those rooms, the times that students seem the most sort of like antsy is when they think they're about to miss a round. So especially if it's still during prelims, when like you don't have those long waits in between, like knowing that that competitive channel does exist, if only to say like, no, we can talk, like you're not going to be penalized. Like I can talk to Tab and your round can start late. Like stuff like that is also, they have to feel like that they're not going to lose the whole tournament. And that some of that comfort just comes from all of those organizational cylinders firing together.
Right.
Yeah, like there's going to be some type of indirect like punishment or consequence for them going to it.
So yeah, and that, you know, I've been in the ombuds position at the state tournament for many years, and what often happens is after round 5 of speech, or you know, a coach will come and say, well, my student just told me that this thing happened to them in round 2, And you say, well, why in the world are you telling us, in round 5 instead of round 2? Well, because they didn't want to miss their next round, right? So they didn't find us. So I think we do need to, Jody, exactly what you just said, and Becca, what you said, that make it clear that, hey, if something happens, if you need to talk to somebody, you are not going to be competitively penalized. We are not going to forfeit out your round because you had to have that conversation.
And that's so much easier to do virtually, because all you have to do is send a message to the room and say, this is an issue, this round will start late, do not penalize any of the speakers. When we're in person, you have to run halfway across the building. It's not that easy.
Not if we keep using technology.
I hope we do.
Online balloting.
Yeah.
I'm also glad that we're having this conversation and that having an equity office is becoming like a board recommendation, because I mean, Rich, you were getting my texts and calls at the state tournament when I'm saying, like, why do I not have this access to the back end of SpeechWire? I can't see a ballot. Like, the only neutral third party in the room, I'm having to like text people to tell me what they said. So having the equity office be recognized where like the SpeechWire access is there and there's the ability to say like, stop the round, is also important.
Well, I did something, and Jody, you'll hear about it, maybe not on Saturday, as I was thinking after I watched all the videos about sexual abuse, exploitation, trafficking that I had to watch for Laurel. I said, why don't we have a ballot statement on every single ballot that said no judge under any circumstance will tell a student on a ballot to contact the judge by email, by phone, by text, by social media, so that they can make further comments.
Oh yeah.
That's just setting us up for horrible situations that 20 years ago, to talk about what was different, would never have happened.
Yeah, I've spent many tournaments contacting coaches and telling them how that judge's behavior was completely inappropriate and they shouldn't be trying to contact minors, that anything they need to say should be on a ballot.
That's a big policy debate thing.
It's also endemic on the national circuit, right? And if you read people's judging paradigms, they have the information right there on their paradigm. Here's my email, or hit me up on Facebook, or all that stuff, right?
Yeah, that's just wrong.
And it tends to be the younger judges. And sometimes it's for a legitimate reason, saying like, add me to the chain with like the case or whatever, like that makes sense. I don't know if there's some platform we should be using, but interestingly, I think
there is a platform in NSDA campus. There is a platform within the system for them to do that. Yeah.
I think it's a lot of young first, second year out judges who in some ways think they're doing something really, really helpful, where they're trying to be the judge that they would have wanted and saying like, I'm not going to give you an empty ballot and a loss, like email me, I'll keep helping you. But it just doesn't fit. But it's definitely, I think the national circuit in general sort of sets the standard with the paradigms and the jokey paradigms. But I think a lot of that comes from like the TOC circuit.
Yeah, I think we need a lot of work around boundaries with respect to our younger judges, right? So, and unfortunately some older judges too, but we do need to do some work around boundaries with that. So this is the part of the session that we had kind of called out for just some general discussion. There's been a lot of really good discussion up to now. Becca, did you have something that you wanted to share, the work from the committee?
I can, yeah. So I can share a couple of things. We're working through, and I'm gonna meet with different people on the task force on Thursday to look at the board recommendations that we're going to submit for the meeting this weekend. So we have sort of a draft of the different sort of strategies that we're recommending that we can kind of go through really quickly. And then Rich, Jody, Vicky, I think Peter, you were in the meeting when we started to create them. If you have any thoughts or concerns, then that might be really helpful. And then I also have a document that we're using on the task force that's I'm just calling it the parking lot. So just sort of the running concerns, questions, suggestions, which we could also maybe spend a few minutes on, just, keep mining for what people are thinking about and what they want us to sort of be working on. Does that sound okay?
Mhm.
Cool. So there were a couple of specific strategies that the board tasked the task force with to make recommendations for this coming meeting to have in place for the competitive season. So number one, oh, sorry, that's me. Number one was provide implicit and explicit bias training. So things that we were talking about, we all seemed to agree that we wanted sort of like what you were describing, Vicki, those like interactive, like, you know, don't touch a bloodborne pathogen. If a student is bleeding, get a paper towel type tests. That we want some sort of interactive thing where there's some sort of certification process. And I have Crawford Lavoie shared the folder with me, but I have the one that we used for NCFL, which I thought was pretty good. It's just basically a Google form that has different questions and different scenarios that, you know, you think about, like, what would you do and what's the issue here? And then it's a Google form that you know, actually comes in. So like, what are things that are appropriate to say? What are things that should not be said? And then just some general education. So this one I think is super helpful as well.
Hey, Becca, my one suggestion here, this does seem to be focused on judges, but I think that many coaches and other people who are involved in speech and debate can benefit from this as well.
Yeah, I should have clarified that. We were thinking that it would be not just for judges. The one that I just showed you is judge specific for sure. But we were sort of thinking about, you know, the implicit bias training. I think a lot of that work is definitional and understanding that, like, and I put the link in the chat, but one of my favorite TED Talks, the Jusha Hockett TED Talk, I love it because the way he teaches about implicit bias removes a lot of blame, where he separates having implicit bias from like being a biased or a malicious person, where I think that just general understanding of like your brain is going to move to the simplest pattern is pretty much the same across the board. And then we sort of talked about like a choose your own adventure, where like a student might go to this option or a coach or a judge might go to this other option. So thinking about meeting the different needs for sure. Yeah, we had like the multiple sets of training. We were talking about having like some statewide training options, could do something at the state tournament, could do a Zoom that we can then record. We also talked about how hopefully next year at the fall coach meeting, we want to see the DEIJ, DEIB session become mandatory rather than an opt-in. Much as I love all of your beautiful faces, I see a lot of you in these. And, you know, I think we're hoping to just make it part of what everyone does together. So I have from Rich that it should not be exclusively judge focused. Are there other ideas, comments, concerns, suggestions that people have?
What are you going to do for kids?
Yeah, would you consider having something for the students too?
Absolutely. And that's something I've done a lot of that at Hawken. We did talk about how that would be a great place to have sort of like a menu of options where many coaches might feel more comfortable doing that sort of training with their own kids. I can also speak for myself. Like I would happily go to another school as long as I can like get there pretty quickly. Or that's not true. I'd make a trip. I have lots of audiobooks where, you know, we could do those sorts of experiences with other students. But one thing we talked about is like, you know, we always, whenever this topic comes up, I think the first response tends to be like, there's never any time in the morning. We don't have time for this, blah, blah, blah. But I think then looking at some of the dead time in tournaments might be something we could consider. So like when you're sitting there for 20 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes, if a judge happened to leave with their ballot and go to Starbucks, like we know we're going to have that dead time that you're just sitting in the auditorium, where like we might be able to make better use of some of those moments. But yes, I definitely think that overall, I think we need more of a vibe that like this is the mission of everyone involved and we're all in it together versus like kids versus adults or Cleveland district versus other districts, that like there are a lot of different strands that we're all working on. We did talk about how explicit bias training feels more like anti-harassment, like that explicit bias felt like something very different.
Right.
In the example Rich gave about the girl who was hugged by her male competitor,
Mhm.
I would think, given the huggy nature of this activity, and everybody's always hugging everybody, you know, coaches are hugging kids on stage and kids are crying and people put their arms around them and all that stuff, that it would be eye-opening to the students to realize that some of these behaviors need permission, that you need to, may I hug you, not just automatically do it, that kind of thing.
Yep.
In fact, one of my students' goals is to ask for consent before he hugs people. That's one of their goals this year, is to ask for consent before he initiates physical contact with people.
Which, you know, coming out of COVID, we've
Mhm.
probably all been doing that anyway.
We do virtual hugs.
Yeah. Yep.
Any other thoughts, concerns, suggestions around the explicit implicit bias training? Peter, I know you were reviewing some of our options. One piece of feedback that I thought was helpful with the trainings that I made last year with like the hand that moves as if powered by no one, especially because of the focus on individual student stories, felt very gender focused, which, you know, I can only work with stories that are available, which as far as I can tell tend to be a lot about gender. Like there are certainly some race stories and some class stories, but having that individual focus, I think did more harm than good. So I won't say I know how to do it. I'm going to make one of my students do it where they can like cut those parts out of it. So that was one thing we were thinking about. Okay, so the next strategy is we kind of lump together, establish an equity officer role and create a self-reporting mechanism that allows individuals to report issues of misconduct. So we were thinking having people identified. Oh, Peter, did you have a thought? You're muted.
Just from the language of strategy 2.2.5, what if we changed misconduct to concerning issues or issues of concern? Or, you know, I think, again, going back to what you guys were saying earlier about DEIJ, we don't want it to be punitive. And as soon as you say it's all about misconduct, I think it kind of...
That's a great catch, Peter. I agree with that entirely.
It kind of leads into like somebody did something wrong and they're going to be punished. And I think because they're like kids don't want to get other kids into trouble necessarily, that has the wrong tone or connotation. Where I think issues of concern, I think is a little bit more open ended and.
Even like reach out to the equity office, like maybe, I think you're right. Concern versus misconduct.
And like when we were talking about like the mandated reporting, I think people need to understand that mandated reporting goes beyond just like calling your parents or calling your coach. That in fact, at times it might be calling the police or calling CPS.
Right. Yep. And that was one thing that we've underlined several times that, you know, last year when I was like slapping together equity office recommendations right before the state tournament, I texted my sister who's a lawyer and said like, oh, am I going to get sued? But we probably need something a little bit more comprehensive than that. So we had Kate Mozinski, who is a lawyer, and her friend Andrew. I think we're going to look at what we have as options. At least for now, we talked about how it really needs to be on Zoom. NSDA campus, you can just join a room rather than like having that password waiting room sort of fail safe where, you know, if I'm in that conversation with a student, I need the ability to say, pause 1 second, you and I are going to go into a breakout room before someone can just burst into the room
and hear the conversation that's going on.
See that someone's there.
Yeah, it's because some people might not want to see that or people to know that they're there at all.
Exactly. So we definitely need that on Zoom.
So we are as a state, we are way behind the curve on equity offices, and a lot of other state organizations and also the National Speech and Debate Association has used equity officers, you know, for quite a number of years now. I'm sure they would be willing to, you know, have us pick their brains, right?
Yep, and I have a lot of it. So Lauren McCool, who is in charge of like coach recognition and education at the NSDA, connected me with a coach who did like a huge list of proposals for Minnesota, and I have access to that. And then I have all of Crawford's stuff from NCFL. So we have a lot of it because it's certainly a place where it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. I was going to say, even with the legal aspect, I'm sure that NSDA has already dealt with the legal aspect, the legal ramifications. So,
Yep.
that might be helpful.
We did have, there was a suggestion to have like a judicial review board. I think this is where our conversation perhaps started to drift away from the equity office and more just to like general issues that you could certainly, I think, house under inclusion, but I think creating that separation, because what we don't want is for this office to feel synonymous with like gloom and doom.
Yeah, and when I hear judicial review board, I'm thinking, wow, that's not what we're talking about in terms of an equity office, right? If we're saying that this equity work is not meant to be punitive, it's not meant to be confrontational. When you start talking about judicial stuff, it feels problematic, right?
Yeah, I think that point was for the OSDA board, that it would not be something that the equity office would do, but we were kind of making a side recommendation to the OSDA that if they're going to be dealing with discipline cases of students, like just in general, like with the whole ethical standards, they should have some clearer process about who deals with that and how they deal with it. Because I don't know that the OSDA has any discipline process for dealing with misconduct.
But I think that that's really outside the equity work.
Yeah.
I mean, because kids get disqualified, right?
Right.
And so when you disqualify somebody, you're opening yourself up to possible ramifications as well. So,
and sometimes, the nature of some of our events, which we love, like have what feel like bizarre rules. Like in duo, for example, you can't make eye contact or you can't touch. Like that's just like an idiosyncrasy of duo, but I don't think we want that level of like, this feels weird and random to be associated with like, don't misgender someone. Like, I think we want those in very different buckets. Are there other ideas or feedback around? My thought was we would have that group of people identified statewide and have that available on the website, that who you can contact on any given weekend, that there should be representation from each district on this list, and that
I just thought that what you guys went through, what Rich went through in the earlier PowerPoint was very clear and succinct, and I thought when we roll this out later to everybody, we could use that that slide with the 3 comparisons. I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah. Peter, thank you for that. And I have to admit that I have just a little bit of trepidation about having like a general equity office that's serving like all the tournaments that weekend in Ohio, right? I kind of feel that each tournament needs to have its own equity officer connected to the tournament, because of the nuances of each tournament. I think that the other aspect of that is that, again, when we get back in person, we want the students who are attending to be able to recognize the face of the person who they can go to and trust with that.
And even if with virtual, like the kids might not recognize who's in the room or feel comfortable talking with them. If it's one room for a weekend, say this weekend, GMB's equity rep is running the room. Kids from other districts might not be comfortable talking with that person because they don't recognize them. They're not familiar with them.
Right. And when you have a dedicated equity officer at a tournament, that's something that can be, made clear to the attendees right at the very beginning, right? Some tournaments do opening ceremonies. That's where you introduce the equity officer right at the beginning at the opening ceremonies.
I totally agree. When I did the action proposal for the summer about tying some of these best practices to bids, which I'm a little bummed that didn't go through. It's certainly something I will be re-proposing in coming years. But my sense of, I was similarly concerned to see this push for like a single Zoom clearinghouse for the entire state on any given weekend. My sense is that it comes from concern about just having enough humans, that in some of the other, certainly not an issue in Cleveland or Akron Canton, but in other districts, do we even have enough people to run a tab room? And I understand that issue, but I do think that we need to put this on a different level where we've got to find ways to make it work and not take the path of like most convenience. So for example, like I'm not that far from like Toledo district. Like I can go over there for a day and be the equity officer. Maybe if that can count as like, and maybe we can do some sort of like, I don't know what the word would be. But
you couldn't do that like every Saturday.
No, but that's where I'm thinking we have that list of like the people throughout the state where like, if I do one Saturday and a couple like, or, like Leslie from Gahanna, like she tends to come up a lot. So let's identify when she's going to be at a groups tournament, and maybe we have some sort of like reciprocity where if like I'm headed to GMV for the day, then like Hawkins not going to be down a judge at whatever tournament my kids are attending. Like, I think that we've got to, I think that this is a moment where we've got to figure out what do we need and then figure out how we get there, rather than starting from the place of like, well, here are all of the obstacles, because right. It's just not the same to have this conversation online. Like at NCFL this year, we had one where a student came in and like the opposing team, like literally ran white supremacy against them in policy where it was also really fast. So that's a moment that like, we could handle it, but that's got to be an in-person conversation where I think that there are a lot of things we've learned. Rich, to your point earlier, like from the technology and from being online, we've learned that maybe you don't need as many people in a tab room. But this is a place where I don't think we can say, look at this easier, more convenient way we figured out how to do this. Like I think at every physical building, got to have somebody. So I think we start from a place of just like, who's willing to do this work? And then we make sure that tournaments are covered every weekend. And, if we need some stopgap this year of sort of the Zoom clearinghouse, I think that, when we're in that transition, I think that's one thing. But I think we have to have a very clear end goal that there is a physical human at every place. And maybe that's also something that like we have a budget for and we can just get people to come do it.
You said a person at every in-person tournament. But let's look at a huge tournament that's in 3 or 4 or 5 different buildings. You need a person in each one of those buildings so that each kid feels that their competition and their role is equally important to someone else. And we always have that problem with, okay, all the important tab people are at the speech building. And the debate buildings are like, well, they don't really need anybody and all that kind of stuff. It's got to be a commitment to the process, and the process requires bodies. And we may have parents who are trained professionals who would say, I'll be available on Zoom, and this is our person, and we can do this. That might be a way to do it until we get back fully in person.
Yeah, Peter?
Yeah, I think to Vicky's last point, I think that was kind of one step on the way to thinking of the virtual office, because we really thought it would be infeasible to get to that level of having an equity officer in every building, considering that some tournaments use maybe 4 buildings. And so if we have an equity officer at a tournament, then the students who are not in the high school, the students who are in the middle school, they might need to communicate with that person virtually anyway. Right. So they're actually, the contact would be virtual, and the person wouldn't be in the same building already. So it's just kind of one step further to have somebody in completely different tournament or a completely different part of the state. But I think one thought that I had, I don't know, like, if we say this or if we, like, when we might use this language, but it's kind of a sad commentary that we don't have more adults who would do this work. Right? That really we should have many people. It shouldn't be difficult to find the people who are willing and competent to do this work. But
my concern from some of the smaller districts isn't that there's a lack of people to do this work as much as there's just like a lack of adults, period. Like to run the tab room, to judge. Like I certainly was not getting the sense that there's like a dearth of people committed to this. And I hear what you're saying about, like, I think it might be Brecksville, where like the middle school and the high school are so close, like you can walk from one to the other, unless you're my students and have to walk outside in the snow for 4 seconds and drive if you're a bunch of wimps. But like, yeah, there probably doesn't need to be a person in each of those buildings. I think I'm cautious about limiting the oh, well, this works type convenient moment.
Yeah.
For example, like, yes, it makes sense to have an online clearinghouse, but like 2 tournaments, Perry and Edison running in the same weekend, probably not running on the same schedule. So like, I still think, or like if the Perry person is seeing me at the Edison tournament, they've probably never seen me before. And that might be a little bit uncomfortable. So I think we've got to think a little bit bigger. I'm a little reticent to use parents, to be perfectly honest. I think that this is a place where it might need to be.
Well, thinking outside the box, I mean, let's toss out the assumption that people have to be connected to speech and debate in some way. If we're going to have equity officers, some of our schools do have equity officers, do have diversity directors, things like that. Could we get one of them to do that duty one weekend, right? People who do this work as part of their jobs, who have no connection to speech and debate, might they be willing to give up a Saturday, like to do something like this?
Okay, that's probably better. Where like, if you come to the equity office, even if you know me, but you have a concern with Hawken kids, that might feel uncomfortable to you. Whereas if it's like our director of DEIJ and she doesn't really care how the team does that day, like that might even feel more comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's why, especially at bigger tournaments, ideally you would have more than one person.
Sure.
So following what we've been discussing, I do think in our recommendations that we should strongly encourage every tournament to have its own equity officer, if at all possible. That we should clearly state in our recommendations that that's to be preferred, and that's sort of the what should be the default. And the Ohio virtual equity office is kind of a stopgap measure, and we're doing that out of necessity, perhaps, but that we want every tournament ideally to make its best effort to find people to play that role, to do that job.
I think
because I think that's really important recommendation for the board to get on this issue then.
Yeah, Peter, I agree with you. I'm also a little bit conscious of time here, especially for Jody, who has been doing this, doing double duty every night since.
This is my third meeting too.
Your third one too. So,
yeah, Peter's come to them all except for the one with Manny today.
So let's see if we can kind of wind this down a little bit. Becca, is there something else that's critical to get out?
Maybe just does anyone have like a burning concern, suggestion, question that they really want to get on the parking lot list? And obviously you or anyone watching can email me or any of us and we can add as we go.
Remind us who the chair of the Equity and Inclusion Committee is for the board?
I think it's me for now, but like I'm not on the board. Like I think I'm task force.
Yeah. It's the culture committee on the board. and that's chaired by Paul.
Okay.
And the other members of that committee are me, Jason Habig, and Scott Quaid.
Okay.
And then the task force is a part of, I guess, under the auspices of the culture committee. And that the task force is currently being, at least for now, being run by Becca.
So my question is, how did you decide that the culture committee would be comprised of 4 men?
None of the women volunteered for it because I have middle school, endowment, and education.
I hear you.
I raised that concern.
Been there.
He did, and I'm just like, I got too much to do already.
Yeah.
Becca, one thing I would like to see is something about like recognizing and reporting grooming behavior.
Yeah, like Vicky alluded to that too with her suggestion on, not giving out your phone number and not asking kids for phone numbers when you're a judge and stuff like that.
And yeah, and really even like coaches need to understand what's considered grooming behavior, because I've had serious issues with coaches that have groomed children and engaged in what I feel are extremely inappropriate, like boundary crossing issues there. And, I kind of get side-eyed because I'm like, that is not what should be happening.
And making sure kids know that is, they see as normal what they're presented with. So they've got to be told that, no, you don't have to deal with that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. As soon as you graduate and you're starting to date that person, that should not be happening.
Yeah.
So that would fall under the anti-harassment piece, right?
That's not necessarily harassment.
Because it's consensual.
Right.
But it's not appropriate in like
right.
Kids don't understand what grooming behavior is.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah, and that's for that reason it's legally not consensual, because the kid who is the minor doesn't have the capacity to consent.
Way up on the top of this document that Becca has, there was something about an ethical statement. Do we have any ethics statements for either coaches, judges, or competitors?
We have something. Hold on.
I mean, I coached forever and I've never seen anything.
I think there is something.
Well, there's the ethical standards like thing that came out, I think a year or 2 ago, pre-pandemic.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, the first two bullets relate.
But I wonder if I do feel like
what we believe. That's not saying I ever